afterwards if anyone has questions, comments, or concerns that they'd like to discuss with me. And it sounds like Sue is available as well. So should you need something, I think you can pop that in the chat box. So as I said, we're going to just talk about my organization, the Child Advocacy Program, and Safe Harbor. We'll discuss the commercial sexual exploitation of children and trafficking. I'll dispel some common myths and misconceptions about trafficking. We'll talk about the different entities involved with traffickers, buyers, and the victims. I guess I should have said this in my content warning. I use the term victim a lot here, and I just want to be clear that we prefer to use the term survivor.
Yeah.
And it's important too to understand the legal aspect of things. So we use the term victim because it corresponds with the legal definitions that we talk about here. So I will use survivor and victim interchangeably. Just like to throw that out there. So we'll talk about the interpersonal dynamics of trafficking, some vulnerabilities and risk factors that make someone more susceptible to commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking, and how to recognize some of the red flags and warning signs. I'll give you a case example, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing here in Chautauqua County to respond. Briefly, as I said, I work for the Child Advocacy Program, and we serve youth and young adults. My program goes up to the age of 21. So that being said, if you're a little over the age of 21, that's okay. We wouldn't close our doors on a young adult either. We would certainly help you, to the best of our abilities, or link you to a better fit for whatever services you may need. But CAP's mission is to end child abuse in Chautauqua County. When abuse occurs, CAP, the Child Advocacy Program, coordinates a community response to bring hope, healing, and justice to children and families. We facilitate Chautauqua County's multidisciplinary team for complex cases of child abuse. And those that could be physical abuse, severe neglect, or even fatalities, human trafficking, certainly, which we're going to talk all about today, but primarily the Child Advocacy Program responds to cases of child sexual abuse. And as we'll talk about, human trafficking falls under that guise of child sexual abuse. So in our multidisciplinary team that we coordinate at CAP, we have partners from all different disciplines that may be involved in these issues. So we have representatives from law enforcement, child protective services, prosecution. We have representatives from the district attorney's office, as well as the county attorneys, medical professionals, mental health professionals, victim advocates, as well as other disciplines. In addition to the multidisciplinary team, CAP conducts forensic interviews. We offer advocacy services, trauma counseling, medical evaluations, community and professional trainings, and the Safe Harbor program. On the screen, this picture here is our office in Jamestown, but we also have an office in Dunkirk. So Safe Harbor is a New York State program. As you can see on the map here, we have New York State. All the counties in our state are funded to some degree to provide this anti-human trafficking initiative. This kind of all came out of major federal legislation that was passed in the year 2000. So 21 years ago, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in the US. Prior to that, so prior to the year 2000, if a person under the age of 18 was engaged in commercial sex, so having sex in exchange for anything of value, food, money, drugs, a place to sleep, whatever, anything of value, that person, that minor, was considered to be perpetrating the law. They were considered to be a prostitute. With this Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that changed the way we see minors engaged in commercial sex. So under this federal law, a child who is under the age of 18 that is induced into providing commercial sex is considered by law to be a victim of trafficking and must be treated as such. Out of that federal legislation came the New York State Safe Harbor for Exploited Children Act in 2008, and New York State started funding various counties to provide this anti-human trafficking work. Chautauqua County started to receive funding for this program in late 2016, and at that point, we had a coordinator that worked for the YWCA of Jamestown, and she was really focused on providing prevention education in elementary, middle school, and high schools to educate students on what trafficking is and how they can identify unsafe situations of exploitation and how to protect themselves. She was able to provide this education in 13 out of the 18 school districts here in Chautauqua County. So that's awesome. But while she was doing that, we found out really soon that this was much more of an issue than we had anticipated. As the previous coordinator, Jessica McKeever, was doing these presentations, she would have students come up to her and disclose instances of commercial sexual exploitation, whether that happened to themselves or to friends or family members. She had teachers, counselors, school nurses, et cetera, coming forward to share stories that they had witnessed it throughout their professions. And it was very clear to the stakeholders in this project and the powers that be in our community that we really needed to, one, continue focusing on that prevention education, but we really needed to educate professionals in the community to understand this issue and to respond in an appropriate and effective way. So the Safe Harbor program shifted its focus in 2019, and I was hired by the Child Advocacy program to coordinate this initiative. And a lot of my, while we still focus on prevention, we have somebody that's still employed with the YWCA that provides this education in the schools. It's an evidence-based curriculum, which is great, wonderful. So that's happening. But on the other side of things, I'm really focused on identification of these cases, how to properly intervene in a trauma-informed, youth-centered way, and coordinating a multidisciplinary response. So as I had mentioned at the Child Advocacy program, we have a whole multidisciplinary team of all these different disciplines of professionals that work with youth who have been sexually abused or have experienced other types of abuse. So as we'll get into in just a moment, trafficking fits right in there. So I work with these organizations to help write policies and write policies for how to identify and intervene in these cases and how to appropriately respond with the best kind of services. But also I educate professionals to be able to kind of then give this education to other people in their organizations and pass it on to the youth that they work with. So as I said, child sexual abuse is kind of like the main term here, but out of child sexual abuse, we have commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC, and that refers to a range of crimes and activities involving the sexual abuse or exploitation of a child for the financial benefit of another person or in exchange for anything of value. Out of commercial sexual exploitation, there's 4 types of commercial sexual exploitation. We have sex trafficking, which I'm going to speak about in just a moment, child sexual abuse images, which is the new term for child pornography. This is huge. We are seeing more and more instances of youth who have been victimized in the realm of sexual abuse images. I always like to give this little anecdote that I heard at a training a couple of years ago, actually last year, excuse me. In the 1980s, our country did a really good job of hampering down on the production and distribution of child sexual abuse images. But in the 90s, with the advent of the internet and more ease and access to sharing photographs and images online, the instances of child sexual abuse images just skyrocketed. Last year in 2020, it was estimated that 100,000 new images of child sexual abuse are uploaded to the internet every day. So again, that's 100,000 new images every day. And we see a lot of this, you know, a lot of this happens, a lot of this commercial sexual exploitation starts with the child sexual abuse images. We oftentimes see perpetrators engaging with youth online in many different social media platforms, YouTube, Pinterest, even all kinds of different platforms, forming these connections, really acknowledging the voids and vulnerabilities that these youth experience, trying to fill those voids, and starting this relationship, so to speak, really grooming that child, and then eventually asking them for, you know, illicit photos or asking them to do something really graphic in a video and send that to them. And often, most of the time, we see that kids will say, no, I don't want to do that, or whatever. They come up with different excuses. And then this offender, this perpetrator, keeps pressuring them and coming up with a lot of other reasons why they should. And then oftentimes the child complies. Perhaps they're being threatened, perhaps a loved one's being threatened, or they're faced with reputational harm. And so maybe they'll send an image or a video, and then that perpetrator will then use that to threaten them to send more. They'll threaten to leak that video or to post it on their Snapchat story or whatnot. Sorry, my cat is going to be all over here. And then we also see this like peer-to-peer, as I'm sure is no surprise to any college students listening today to this session. We have a lot of kids that we see, and again, my program goes up to the age of 21, who perhaps shared an illicit picture with a boyfriend, and then that boyfriend decided that he was going to share it with his friends, and it gets into the wrong hands, and that can be really harmful to someone. So that falls under the guise of commercial sexual exploitation. Other times though, I mean, we have straight up like what you think of when you hear the words child pornography or child sexual abuse images. We have adults that will groom kids, not necessarily online, in person, and cultivate these relationships and force them to do sexual things in front of a camera. And then they distribute those images countless times. We're working on a case right now. If you were to Google the child advocacy program, child pornography, I'm sure this would pop right up. There was a person that was a resident of Chautauqua County that was arrested a little over a year ago for child sexual abuse images. And we are, fortunate to be able to work with several of the survivors of that crime at our advocacy center and, provide trauma therapy for them and help them to find some hope and healing as they pursue justice on a larger scale. And then we have survival sex under the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And survival sex is just as the name implies, it's having sex in exchange for one's basic needs. So this is something we see also a lot in Chautauqua County. It's not uncommon for kids to be kicked out of their house, maybe for their the way that they identify sexually, or maybe, whatever. There's even just conflict with parents. We see, obviously we live in a really conservative area, and there's a lot of parents that just can't deal with the world right now. And we have several youth that have come across, our program that aren't safe at home, or they were thrown away or thrown out of their homes, and they're looking for a place to stay. And maybe they're couch surfing here or there for a little while, or they're staying with friends, but often, they wear out their welcome. And before they know it, they're forced to trade sex for a place to sleep. Or we've had kids in our county that have traded sex for shoes, for coats, for a cell phone. Survival sex is, definitely something that happens here. And it's, I think, important to note that research tells us that within 48 hours of a youth being unaccompanied on the streets, they'll be propositioned for commercial sex. And then stripping and dancing. Not really going to go into that. I think we all know what that means, but that is a form of commercial sexual exploitation. So the difference between sex trafficking and those other forms of exploitation is that human trafficking always involves a third party, and that third party benefits from the abuse. So you have the sex buyer or the John, the provider or the victim, and then the trafficker. And that trafficker is orchestrating the exchange of sex for money, and that trafficker benefits financially. So what is human trafficking? Simply put, trafficking is modern day slavery. It's the commodification of human life. Or in other words, human trafficking is taking advantage of someone for labor and or sex in exchange for something of value. We primarily focus on child sex trafficking. However, we do see and respond to cases of labor trafficking here in Chautauqua County. Labor trafficking, we tend to see that more in the northern end of the county, Dunkirk, Fredonia, Westfield, Sherman, Ripley, all along really where the grapes are. We see a lot in the grape industry. We've had several youth that have been identified to be victims of labor trafficking, and throughout getting to know them and hearing their stories and learning more about their experiences, we've learned that they've also been sex trafficked. So typically they go, it's not uncommon for that to go hand in hand. Up here on the screen now, we have the legal definitions of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or, which I've mentioned, in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So to be clear, commercially sexually exploited youth are victims and not perpetrators of crimes, regardless of the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. From a legal standpoint, an individual under the age of 18 engaged in commercial sexual activity is always considered to be a victim. And, I kind of harp on this point because it's not uncommon still, although that law was passed 21 years ago, for youth who are engaged in commercial sex to be sometimes arrested for that when legally they shouldn't be. So we talk about this point a lot. But there's lots of myths and misconceptions about what trafficking is. If there's So you go on the internet, which I'm sure all of you do, you've probably seen a lot of these myths and misconceptions. There's a lot of QAnon conspiracies about what trafficking is, which is, they're not true, and it takes away from the actual issue that's happening. The media, different movies, television shows, etc., are not accurate portrayals of this social issue and this heinous crime, really. So one of the myths that we hear often is that trafficking always involves transporting the victim across state, country, or other borders. The truth is that this is not included in the federal definition of trafficking. An individual can be recruited and exploited for labor or commercial sex without having crossed any borders. The majority of kids that we see in our program, and I'll get to in just a minute, the numbers of youth that have come across, been a part of our program, the majority are US citizens. They're Chautauqua County kids that are trafficked or sold for sex right here in the towns and villages, cities that they live in. Sometimes they might, live in Jamestown and they're being brought to different parts of Buffalo to be sold for sex, or to Erie, Pennsylvania, or somewhere in Ohio. Like, we do see that sometimes, but we live, kind of in a place where there's access to a lot of different other cities. But the majority of kids that we see are trafficked in their own neighborhoods, oftentimes in their own homes by their parents. Another myth is that all trafficking victims in the US are from other countries. Again, that's untrue. Trafficking victims may be US citizens or foreign nationals. We have had, since I've been coordinating this program, we've had over 100 kids referred to the program, and only 4 of them have not been US citizens. Again, like I said, typically what we see here in Chautauqua County are kids being trafficked right in their own communities. And the last myth I have for you is that individuals must be physically restrained or locked up to be a victim. While some victims may be physically held by their trafficker, psychological means of control, trauma bonds, threats, coercion are far more common. Again, like, if you think of trafficking, you might go to that movie Taken, right? Well, that's not really an accurate portrayal of what happens here. Sure, that stuff happens, anything is a possibility. But really what we see are those psychological means of control of traffickers using threats, coercion, vacillating between these, really extreme behavioral characteristics to really manipulate and control their victims psychologically and emotionally. So the prevalence of human trafficking is difficult to know for sure. It's a very underreported crime. Folks that are engaged in trafficking are very unlikely to self-identify that they are being victimized. Worldwide, it's estimated that 24.9 victims are trafficked globally. In the US, according to Polaris, who operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline, in the year 2019, over 22,000 victims and survivors were identified. Here in Chautauqua County, since we started keeping data in late 2016, we've had 138 kids referred to the Safe Harbor program and identified to be at risk for the commercial sexual exploitation of children, which includes trafficking, survival sex, sexual abuse images. Of those 138, and this data was as of the beginning of April, so out of those 138, 23 of those kids have met that federal definition of child sex trafficking that I read to you. And that's by their own disclosure. So oftentimes, like I said, we have 138 kids identified to be at risk. A lot of them, I think that the numbers, and I don't have it written on the screen, but I think 88 of those 138 are considered to be at high risk based on this evidence-based tool that we use to determine risk level. Of those 88, many of them, we are 99.9% certain that they have been trafficked or meet that federal definition of child sex trafficking, but we only count them as meeting that definition if that's from their own disclosure to us. We might hear other things from other people, we might see things, but unless that youth is ready to identify that that's happened to them, we won't say that for them. The average age upon first referral to our program is 13.47 years old. Globally, the average age to enter trafficking is 12, so we're just a little bit above that. And 89.9% of these youth identify as girls. And I think that that number certainly does not mean that this only happens to girls. I think that with a lot of other interpersonal crimes, In issues like this, girls are more likely to self-identify and to report instances of exploitation. So who are the traffickers? Exploiters have been family members, peers, romantic partners, educators, employers, community leaders, clergy, people of all ages, ethnicities, and genders. There's really no certain profile here. But what we do see is two really distinct character types. We have a guerrilla pimp and a Romeo pimp. The guerrilla pimp is a pimp who controls his victims almost entirely through physical violence and force. This is the type of pimp you see on TV and in movies. Flashy, lots of jewelry, fancy cars, etc. And then there's the Romeo pimp. He maintains control of his victims using psychological manipulation. As the name implies, a Romeo pimp capitalizes on his victims' need to feel loved, seen, and desired. They use the boyfriending technique by romancing the victims with false feelings and promises to fill their voids and vulnerabilities. This method inspires fierce loyalty from the victim. So typically in the experiences that that have been shared with me from youth that I've spoken with and youth that my team partners have spoken with, and in research I've done, most traffickers kind of vacillate between these two styles, the Romeo pimp and the guerrilla pimp. Typically they'll start out as the Romeo pimp, really these false feelings and promises of love. And once that they've kind of like quote unquote hooked their victim, then they switch over to that guerrilla pimp, that more violent and forceful character. So who are the Johns or the buyers? Again, demographic traits are poor predictors of sex buying. Race and sexual orientation have almost no profiling power. What we do know is that active high frequency buyers are much more likely than other men to make $100,000 or more annually. But what we do know in Chautauqua County is that's not necessarily true. We've been told about, and we've come across instances of Johns or sex buyers of every race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, income, bracket, education level, whatever, really anybody, men, women, folks of all genders. So let's talk a little bit about the dynamics of human trafficking. We talked about how the pimps or the traffickers vacillate between that Romeo and guerrilla style pimp. And in doing so, they're creating this severe power imbalance between themselves and their victim. And like I said, they're alternating between this brutal and seductive behavior, and they force social isolation on their victims oftentimes. So when we talked about, like, one of those myths was that victims would be locked up or restrained, like that's not always the case, but traffickers will isolate them socially from their support systems, whether that's by feeding them lies about their parents or their friends or their family or even people in their neighborhood. Often, they will do whatever they can to kind of get that victim, that person, to separate themselves from other people so that this trafficker has more power over them. And this forces a psychological bond on their child victims, and which can lead to trauma coercive bonding or Stockholm syndrome. If you're not familiar with Stockholm syndrome, it's really just a fascinating concept. And I think, if you have some time, I would certainly search it up. On the left side of the screen here, you can see the power and control wheel. If you have any education about domestic violence, you may have seen something very similar to this. This is an adaptation of the Duluth power and control wheel for domestic violence. And it just talks about all the different methods that traffickers use to impose their power and control. So whether that's isolation, like we talked about, emotional abuse, intimidation, threats, coercion, economic abuse, they use their privilege, sexual abuse, and like gaslighting, minimizing, denying, and blaming. So all these different tactics are put into play. So what to watch out for? We're going to discuss some vulnerabilities, risk factors, red flags, and warning signs. On the left side of the screen is a long list of vulnerabilities. And just keep in mind that we're talking, specifically about child sexual, commercial sexual exploitation and child sex trafficking. But this is often, it's not really any different for young adults. We see the same thing on the other age range of things. So traffickers understand that when a person presents with some vulnerabilities, they're going to be more easily manipulated, perhaps. And they really play up these vulnerabilities of people that feel that they're misunderstood, or youth that want to develop romantic relationships, or their feelings of insecurity or conflict with their parents or caregivers. Maybe they don't feel valued or loved. They want more independence, want attention and affection, test boundaries and take risks. And I just like to point out that's those are all common characteristics or vulnerabilities that young people have. And so it really just goes to show that anybody could fall prey to human trafficking. The last 2 points on the left side of the screen are super important. Attachment to consumer goods. Here in Chautauqua County, it's a pretty economically depressed area, and we oftentimes have young people that are unable to afford the material goods that they want to have. And if you think back perhaps when you were in middle school or high school, and often we just want to fit in. We want to have a new cell phone or the cool shoes or whatever it might be at the moment. And we've had youth that are unable to provide, their families are unable to provide those goods for them. They may be too young to work or unable to, have a job that provides enough income for what they're looking for. And traffickers really prey on that, and they will entice young people with these consumer goods, these material goods. And access to a computer or smartphone is huge. Like I was talking about when we were talking about child sexual abuse images, so much of this commercial sexual exploitation starts on a computer, in a chat room, in a smartphone, over messaging, Snapchat, whatever. And it's just, people can have such, private conversations without other people even knowing what's going on. When I was growing up, it was a big thing. It's like stranger danger, stay away from strangers, which is not really the right thing when we talk about interpersonal crimes. When we talk about like trafficking, 77% of youth who are trafficked know their trafficker. It's a trusted adult in their lives. But that being said, like there are instances when, it's just random people looking to exploit somebody. So right now, especially with the pandemic, a lot of youth are schooling remotely and just have kind of unlimited, unsupervised access to a computer or smartphone. So many of these conversations and this grooming is happening right here in people's homes. And then there's a whole bunch of risk factors that make someone more susceptible. So a history of sexual or physical abuse is very common among people that have been trafficked. A history of interaction with the foster care system and juvenile justice system. In New York State, it's estimated that of youth who have been trafficked in New York, 83% of them have a past interaction with the foster care and juvenile justice system, foster care or juvenile justice system. And if you're familiar with the foster care system or the criminal justice system, you know that those systems in and of themselves can be very traumatizing. And oftentimes a person's experience that leads them to those systems can be incredibly traumatizing as well. And traffickers understand that, and they recognize that that people that have had experiences in those systems are likely to have a number of other risk factors and a number of other vulnerabilities that make them more susceptible to trafficking and make them, quote unquote, easier targets. Unhoused youth or youth who have run away, like I said, unaccompanied youth on the streets are propositioned for commercial sex typically within 48 hours of being alone on the streets. Undocumented or unaccompanied children are at a greater risk. Youth with developmental or intellectual disabilities and youth who identify as LGBTQIA+ are at a greater risk. So red flags and warning signs, what to watch out for. If there's somebody in your life who is chronically running away, gone for a significant amount of time, that could be a huge indicator that they are being trafficked or being forced to do something against their will. If they use street slang for sex work, or perhaps their number of sexual partners is not consistent with their age or development. If a youth has a significantly older partner or spends a lot of time with a controlling person or an older adult. Sexually provocative social media posts, including photos of cash, drugs, hotel stays. This has been something, specifically these social media posts have helped service providers in our community to recognize kids that they work with that are being exploited. We've seen changes in their social media profiles and their posts, and that has, brought up some radars. And so in talking to that child, we found out, or those children, because it's happened many times, that they are being exploited, or they're being forced into situations of commercial sex. Like we were talking about with the material goods, if a youth has items that they do not have the means to obtain, so like technology, clothing, shoes, etc., that can be an indicator that somebody is giving them those in exchange for perhaps something of sexual nature. Frequent school absences, or they're working more than they are in school, reluctant to discuss how they make money or where they live, or how and when they came to the United States, and indications or reports of domestic violence, intimate partner violence can be a clue or warning sign that some kind of sexual exploitation is going on. So there's physical red flags that we look for. Tattoos expressing ownership is huge. It's very common for traffickers to brand or tattoo their victims. We often see like money signs or crowns or like barcodes, like really showing ownership. We had a case, if you Google Child Advocacy Program or human trafficking in Chautauqua County, a lot of these examples will come up from the Post Journal or the Dunkirk Observer, showing some like local cases that we've had here. But there was an instance, I want to say in 2018, that a man from Jamestown was arrested for leading a sex trafficking ring. And one of the first survivors that came forward and disclosed that this had happened to her, she had a really like different tattoo. Oh my gosh, this cat on her, she had this tattoo on her neck, and it was just like a very weird symbol. And one of the professionals that was working with her just asked her about that. And she explained that it was a symbol like representing her trafficker's nickname. And he used that same tattoo on all of the girls that he was trafficking. And with her sharing that, we were able to identify several other young women and girls that had been trafficked by the same individual. Other physical red flags may be multiple or frequent STIs, pregnancies, miscarriages, or abortions. Like the frequent, all of this is not uncommon. We've had, there is another case that again, you can Google and read a little bit about. There was a young woman that was arrested in, I believe it was December, but sometime in the end of 2020, from Jamestown, who was trafficking young girls throughout the county. And one of the young girls, in sharing her story with us at the Child Advocacy Program, explained that her trafficker, this young woman, would take her to a hotel, send her in a room by herself, give her a handful of pills, typically Molly, sometimes some other stuff, tell her, take these and I'll be back in a few days. And in between that time she'd go in the hotel room, so the time that the trafficker would pick her up, multiple men, probably 8, 9, 10 men a night or a day, would come in, rape her, and then leave. And she was never able to use any protection when having sex with these strange men. And fortunately, she never had any pregnancies or miscarriages or needed to have an abortion, but she had contracted a long list of STIs. And it's just really sad. It's super sad. But that was something like that, the symptoms of that, of those STIs are what kind of caused her to come forward and seek help, because she knew what wasn't happening to her, or what was happening to her wasn't right. And she was able to kind of make that step, come forward and explain her situation. And in her doing so, she kind of paved the way. There was 3 other young girls that were also involved that have since come forward and are receiving lots of help now. So that's awesome. But evidence of sexual abuse is another indicator, or explanations of are inconsistent with injuries, or perhaps somebody has untreated injuries, which could be a sign of some kind of sexual exploitation. And then behavioral, emotional, and psychological red flags. A noticeable change in behavior, disconnection from social supports, like we talked about. Traffickers will try to socially isolate their victims, suicidal ideations, depression, anxiety, or other trauma symptoms. If someone's fearful or scared of consequences to a degree greater than the situation warrants, or perhaps they're dependent on a friend to answer questions, or there's gaps in their story. So as I mentioned a couple of times, victims are very unlikely to self-identify. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, and just a few of them listed here on the screen. But some of the individual barriers might be fear of threats of violence or reprisals against loved ones, maybe they're indebted to their trafficker, or they fear reputational harm, or perhaps this is quote unquote better than the old life. As I mentioned, 83% of youth who have been trafficked in New York State have a history of interaction with the foster care or juvenile justice system. And again, like, I was discussing, is that chances are, if you're in those systems, you've had a heck of a lot of trauma in your life, a lot of adversity. And traffickers get that, they recognize that, and those are the kids that they prey on. And sometimes these situations, and to be really frank and really blunt, this sounds terrible, but like that young woman, that teenager that I was talking about, that was given these handful of mollies and sent into a hotel room and made forced to, she was raped by several men multiple days in a row. That might seem better to somebody than perhaps being raped by your father, or raped by your uncle, or whatever, or having, being forced to have sex with your brother repeatedly, because those are things that happen all over the place, but they certainly happen here in Chautauqua County. So we can see how like a long lifetime of trauma and adversity can really skew someone's perception of what's a normal experience and what's not. So then there's social barriers, prevailing attitudes towards individuals engaged in commercial sex. That's huge. There's a lot of ideas and thoughts and just viewpoints about commercial sex and sex work in our society. And oftentimes those are, people have negative views or attitudes towards individuals engaged in that. There may be fear about how you'll be treated by authority figures, fear being reinforced by lies from the trafficker or individual experiences. So again, with that past interaction with the criminal justice system or juvenile justice system and the foster care system, just being a part of those systems and the things you have to go through, like that can be re-traumatizing for someone, and that might inhibit someone from coming forward or reporting or identifying that this is something, that this exploitation or trafficking is happening to them. And then there's also a story I heard at a training a couple of years ago that was just so fascinating. It was not in New York State. I want to say it was like Ohio or something, but I'm not so sure, where this man owned a nail salon, and he had women, the women that were working there were being labor trafficked and sex trafficked. And every day he had a sign in his window that said like free coffee for law enforcement. And every day cops would come in, have coffee, and like shoot the breeze with this owner. And they didn't suspect anything was going on. He seemed like a really stand-up guy. He was all about giving them their free coffee and, shooting the breeze, hanging out. Well, every time that a police officer would come in and then leave, the owner would turn to his workers and threaten them and say, like, if you think they'll believe you over me, like, these are my friends, like, you've seen them come in here and the way we talk, like, they won't believe you. If you ever try to come forward, you're going to, like, you won't be believed. Eventually it was uncovered. I don't know exactly how that happened. And that man was charged with those crimes. But that's just an example of how traffickers use that fear of authority figures. And then there's, like I talked about, the normalization of the experience, homophobic and discriminatory views about LGBTQIA+ youth. That's a huge barrier. Like we talked about, pretty conservative county. We've had several kids in our program that have been kicked out of their homes for the way that they sexually identify, and there's nowhere for them to go. Like, we have a safe house, there's a shelter for youth, but oftentimes, somebody's staying there, they might not be able to comply with all the rules and regulations, and maybe that's not the safest place for them either. And so we often see these kids ending up on the streets and being exploited right here in our county on the streets. And then there's structural and systemic oppression, of course, that prevents people from coming forward. And then there's environmental barriers. Lack of economic choices leave victims susceptible to false promises of security or a better life, and vulnerable to document confiscation and threats of deportation. And when we talk about document confiscation, that's not just for folks that are undocumented or that are not US citizens. It's any kind of document confiscation. If you've ever needed to access social services in New York State, you know that you need identification, and traffickers know that too. So if they have a child or a young adult that they've been trafficking, and that person's dependent on the trafficker for their livelihood, really, for a place to sleep, clothes to wear, food to eat. And they know, if I'm going to get out of this situation, I've got to get some money, I've got to get a place to sleep, I need food, right? And they can't access these benefits without proper identification. So we see that a lot too, of traffickers confiscating that. So I'm going to read you a short case example about Sarah. So this is Sarah's story. Her best friend introduced them. Things got serious quickly. David asked Sarah to live with him only after a month. Sarah was nervous about it, but she figured it was better than her current situation. Her parents were strict and she never had any freedom. They gave her everything she wanted, except for affection and praise. David gave her butterfly feelings every time she saw him. He told her she was beautiful and kind, and he would do anything for her. As soon as she moved in, David changed. David asked her to have sex with one of his friends. He acted like he felt bad about it, but said that he owed some money and it would really help him out. Sarah didn't understand how David could be okay with her having sex with another guy, but she loved him and wanted to help. Afterwards, David told her how much he loved her. A few weeks went by before he asked for another favor. This time he wanted her to have sex with a few strangers to help pay rent. When she said she didn't want to, he started yelling that she was stupid and she was lucky he was willing to take care of her. Sarah felt really bad because he had done so much for her, so she agreed. After that, David told her this is how he expected her to pay her portion of the rent and other expenses from now on. So just something for you to think about. Take a moment to kind of run through this in your head, but can you think of any vulnerabilities that Sarah presented with? Or how did David use those vulnerabilities to his advantage? And as an outsider, would you recognize those vulnerabilities? And what could you have done to help Sarah? So briefly, before we wrap it up here, we're doing a lot in Chautauqua County to respond to this, but it's still a growing problem. So I'm doing lots of community outreach and awareness like this with all kinds of professionals and groups like yours all throughout the county to really educate people on this issue because, the layperson that's not doing this work doesn't necessarily see how major of an issue this is. But outside of that community awareness and outreach, we have this multidisciplinary approach that I talked about. We review these cases of commercial sexual exploitation with our multidisciplinary team. We have the Safe Harbour Critical Team, which meets quarterly to review systemic issues around trafficking, exploitation, identifying and reporting and intervening with these cases. We collaborate with community partners. We've had a lot of interest from just folks in the community that have heard about trafficking, heard about the Safe Harbor program, and have come forward and offered to, some volunteer time to do some work. So we started a community action team, and that group, myself and the former Safe Harbor Coordinator, Jessica, who I mentioned, are kind of leading that action team, and we're educating those volunteers to provide the same outreach that basically I'm doing here today. We also participate on the Western District of New York Human Trafficking Task Force, and that is a task force made up of law enforcement, all different kinds of law enforcement. So here, we work with all these jurisdictions anyways, but these are folks that are specifically focused on human trafficking. So we have local police officers, sheriffs, state police. We have the FBI, Homeland Security, NCIS, basically any kind of law enforcement that you can think of is part of, in some way, collaborating, or we have access to collaborate with them on these cases. And then what else? We've developed referral pathways. I don't have one of those in front of me, but it's a flow chart that explains two different agencies, like, for example, the Boys and Girls Club or the YMCA and the YWCAs. Like, we'll educate their staff on those warning signs and risk factors that I talked to you about today. And so if they notice a kid in one of their programs that might fit that criteria, they can use this referral pathway, this flow chart, to figure out exactly what to do. We have a quick screening tool and a comprehensive assessment. Both of those screening and assessment tools were provided to us by the Office of Children and Family Services from New York State, and they're evidence-supported tools that help us identify if the screening tool helps us identify if somebody might be at risk for trafficking, and that comprehensive assessment helps us identify if they meet that federal definition of trafficking, or if they're at a high risk or a medium risk for trafficking. Then we use that information to provide education to that youth, to explain to them their risk factors and ways that they can protect themselves and reduce their risk and reduce any harm that might be happening to them. And we use them in our MDT case reviews because oftentimes we have a youth might be referred to our program that is maybe on probation, and she's also engaged with a mental health therapist, and she's also perhaps seeking treatment for a sexual assault at one of the local hospitals. So all of those players can come together and discuss the different aspects of what's going on to help provide the best course of treatment and coordinate care for that person. And again, like I mentioned, and I think in the beginning, like we try to do this really youth-centered and survivor-centered. So when we have these case review meetings, it's different when we talk about youth, but especially for the older youth, we really like to provide them with options and not just, tell them this is what you should do to make it better. That's not, what we do, but we look at things from all these different discipline perspectives to kind of see, okay, well, these are your legal rights here. These are your medical options. These are the best forms of psychotherapy that would be helpful interventions for you or whatnot, and provide that information and then coordinate that care. So like I said, community outreach and awareness. I'm a licensed mental health professional, and I provide trauma counseling to youth who have been trafficked and sexually exploited. I'm trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, problematic sexual behavioral therapy, and I'm currently getting trained for EMDR as well. And then lots of ongoing training and research about trafficking so that I can kind of be up to date and provide that information to the other folks that I work with. So that's pretty much it about trafficking and the Safe Harbor program. My contact information is on the screen here, top part of the right side. The bottom part of the right side is a number I like to point out. So that's the Human Trafficking Confidential Tip Line, and that goes directly to one of the sheriffs in Chautauqua County, who is the main point person for human trafficking and law enforcement in our county. So if perhaps you are concerned about trafficking with somebody in your life, you can always reach out to me, or if you'd like to be more confidential, that number is confidential. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if anybody has any questions before we wrap it up.
Any quick ones, because we are actually over our time. We have a little going back and forth between workshops, but are there any questions that need immediate? Also know that if you have questions after, you can contact us at GLIS. We'll be happy to forward those to Kayleah, get those or make the connections for you as well. And I don't see any, there's none in the chat. So Kayleah, I just want to thank you so much for being here. Amazing information, so much to process, but so important. And just thank you for all the work you're doing in Chautauqua and for all the information you gave us here to be aware of here for all the different places that we all come from. So thank you all for joining. There's 4 more workshops, 2 in each of the sessions of Workshop A and Workshop B. Hopefully you'll be joining those again today, and drive safe. See you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.